The dashcam showed the deputy unconscious for over an hour, but the radio kept playing his voice, alive, asking the sheriff to come down. In November, the Park County Sheriff's Office logged 7 911 calls in under 20 minutes, all from an isolated campground near Dead Indian Pass. Callers described trees ripped from the ground and thrown against cabin walls, propane tanks torn loose from their fittings, and a scream so deep it rattled window glass a quarter-mile off. Dispatch logged the calls as a possible bear incident. Nobody who worked that dispatch desk that night believed it, not really, but nobody had a better word for it either. When Sheriff Lewis Dean and Deputy Riley Cotton reached the site 40 minutes later, the campground was empty. Tents stood collapsed and shredded. A cooler had been crushed flat against a picnic table, and the campers themselves were simply gone. No blood, no drag marks, no vehicles missing from the gravel lot. Dean radioed dispatch to confirm nobody had self-evacuated on foot. The answer came back negative. 6 adults and 2 children had vanished from a fence site in under 20 minutes without leaving a single footprint toward the road. Beside an abandoned patrol vehicle near the tree line, pressed into frozen mud, sat a single bipedal footprint over 20 inches long. A severed telephone cable draped across it from 10 feet overhead, sheared clean rather than snapped, as if something had reached up and simply pulled it down on the way past. Dean crouched over the print for a long time before he spoke. "That's not Bear," he said quietly, more to himself than to Cotton. "Bear doesn't walk on 2 feet for 20 consecutive strides." Cotton had been a deputy for 6 years and had never once heard her sheriff sound uncertain. She crouched beside the print, breath fogging in the beam of her flashlight, and pressed 2 fingers into the mud beside it, testing the resistance. "Ground's like concrete," she finally said. "Something this size doesn't sink 4 inches into concrete hard mud. Not without weight I can't put a number on. We're talking 600-700 pounds minimum on 2 feet. Dean didn't answer. He was already looking toward the ravine, where his other deputy's cruiser had gone silent on the radio 40 minutes earlier and hadn't checked back in since. He tried the channel twice more, got dead air both times, and made the call to split their search. Cotton would hold the campground and secure it as a scene, while he drove the fire road toward the last known coordinates of the missing cruiser. It was, in hindsight, the decision he would replay for the rest of his life, the moment where procedure told him to wait for backup and instinct told him a man was dying somewhere in the dark. He chose instinct. They found the second cruiser at the bottom of the ravine, not crashed, not rolled off the shoulder in an accident. Thrown. The undercarriage sat 40 feet downhill from the tire marks at the road's edge, and there were no skid marks at all, no braking, as if the vehicle had simply left the pavement airborne. The engine block sat cracked open like fruit beside the wreck, coolant steaming faintly in the cold, and one door had been peeled outward on its hinges with a force that left the metal curled like paper. Dean's radio crackled to life as he stood at the ravine's edge staring down at the wreckage, and his missing deputy's voice came through the static, steady, almost conversational. "Sheriff, I'm hurt. Come down the ravine." He keyed the mic to respond and got no reply, only the same 6 words looping back a moment later in the exact same cadence. The exact same inflection, word for word, like a recording rather than a man in pain. Cotton had followed him down against his orders, unwilling to wait alone at the campground with the woods gone silent around her, and she caught up to him at the ravine's lip in time to hear the loop repeat a 3rd time. "That's not right," she said, watching his face rather than the wreck below. "That's not a hurt man's voice. Hurt men don't sound that even. They stutter, they slur, they beg. That sounds rehearsed." Dean already knew she was right. He climbed down anyway. Because the alternative was standing at the top of a ravine listening to a friend's voice ask for help and doing nothing about it. And some decisions a man has to live inside of afterward no matter which way he chooses. Halfway to the wreck, his boot caught on something that gave slightly underfoot, and his flashlight found the deputy's body slumped against the driver's door, unconscious, a deep gash open across his scalp, blood already frozen black in his hair. And the radio in his cruiser was still transmitting, still looping the same 6 words. On a channel Dean's men swore afterward the injured deputy had never even had programmed into his set. Something else had been speaking through it. Cotton's flashlight swept the ridgeline above them on instinct, chasing a sound neither of them could name, and the beam caught 2 points of dull amber reflection retreating into the treeline. Gone before she could get a clean look, gone before she could even call it out loud. "Tell me you saw that," she said, voice flat with the effort of staying calm. Dean had. Neither of them said the word out loud yet, not even to each other, because saying it made it real in a way the footprint hadn't managed to. They loaded the unconscious deputy into the truck bed as gently and as fast as human hands could manage. Radios dead silent now on every channel they tried. Static where dispatch should have been. The climb back up the ravine felt 3 times longer than the climb down had. Every dry branch overhead suddenly sounding exactly like a footstep placed with deliberate care. Every shift of wind through the pines sounding like breathing that wasn't theirs. By the time they reached the ridge trail and got the truck moving again, the forest had gone unnaturally still. No wind, no birdsong, not even the tick of the engine cooling, just the crunch of tires on frost and a cold that seemed to thicken the air itself. Dean swept his spotlight through the canopy on pure instinct, the way a man checks a mirror he doesn't consciously remember deciding to check, and the beam caught something roughly 90 feet up the slope. 2 amber points staring back, unblinking, positioned nearly 7 feet off the forest floor. The light held on the shape for 2 full seconds before it moved. Not fleeing the beam the way any animal should, but circling, deliberate, cutting between trunks with a silence that shouldn't have been possible at whatever mass was casting that footprint back at the campground. Cotton raised her rifle out of pure reflex and lowered it just as fast, the tree cover already swallowing the shape whole. "I can't get a clean line on it," she said, breathing hard. "It's using the slope on purpose. It's using us." Dean understood then, with a cold certainty that settled somewhere under his ribs, that whatever was out there wasn't reacting to headlights the way a startled bear reacts. It was hunting them the way one man hunts another, reading terrain, choosing ground, waiting. This was the reversal that changed everything Dean thought he understood about the night. The amber eyes weren't circling the truck out of curiosity. They were pacing it, matching speed on the slope above without ever closing distance, and Dean realized with a jolt that it had been doing exactly that since the ravine. Following, patient, herding them towards something rather than away from it. He eased off the gas without meaning to, some animal part of his own brain telling him that speeding up would only invite whatever this was to stop pacing and start closing. Then the low frequency hit. Not a roar, not a howl, but a pressure, a vibration that traveled through the truck's frame and through both their chests at once, deep enough to blur the edges of Dean's vision for a full second. Cotton's nose began to bleed without warning. A thin line she didn't notice until it reached her lip. The truck's side windows spider-cracked from the inside out with a sound like ice breaking underfoot, and somewhere behind them the unconscious deputy in the truck bed groaned for the first time since the ravine, as though even unconsciousness couldn't fully protect him from whatever that sound was doing to a human skull. Dean grabbed the radio to call it in and got only static, the amber eyes gone from the ridge above, the sudden silence afterward somehow worse than the sound had been. The specific, listening quality of a silence where something is choosing not to make noise rather than a silence where nothing is there at all. He kept the spotlight sweeping the treeline in wide, useless arcs, hands steady only because 2 decades of training had taught his body to hold steady even when the rest of him wanted to shake. That was the moment the FBI convoy arrived. 3 black SUVs cresting the fire road at speed with headlights blazing. No plates visible, no markings beyond a small embossed placard on the lead vehicle's door that Dean recognized from a classified briefing years earlier, one he'd been explicitly told afterward to forget he'd ever attended. SSA Armando Davidson stepped out of the lead vehicle before it had fully stopped moving, already speaking into a lapel mic in short clipped phrases. Agent Allison Sharp close behind him with a tablet already lit and tracking a signal on a frequency the sheriff's department had never owned or requested. That was when Sharp's tablet screamed a proximity alert, sharp and sudden enough to make both agents stop mid-stride. A signal source moving at speed, then a second, then a third, circling their position from 3 separate directions at once, closing the gap steadily rather than fleeing the new headlights the way any single frightened animal should have. Not one creature, a coordinated pattern of them, moving with a discipline that made Davidson's clipped confidence falter for the first time since he'd stepped out of the vehicle. "Sharp, get that feed to command now," he said, and for the first time his voice had lost its flatness. The attack didn't come at the agents directly. It came at the road itself, at the one thin ribbon of asphalt that was the only route out of the valley. Something Dean's spotlight only half caught in motion tore a power line free from a splintered pole overhead and dropped it in a shower of sparks across the lead SUV's hood. And the vehicle went up in a sheet of orange flame that lit the entire clearing white for a full 3 seconds. The heat hit Dean's face from 30 feet away. The only route out of the valley was now burning, and Davidson's carefully trained comm cracked audibly for the first time, shouting for a defensive perimeter as Sharp dragged her equipment clear of the spreading fire. Dean understood in that moment that the creatures weren't attacking blind, weren't simply lashing out at headlights the way a cornered animal might. They understood exactly what a burning vehicle meant to a group of people trapped at the bottom of a single-road canyon. That this wasn't animal aggression, this was strategy, and strategy meant something had either taught it to them or they'd learned it themselves across however many years they'd been avoiding exactly this kind of confrontation. Cotton grabbed his arm hard enough to bruise and pointed uphill, where the largest shape yet stood fully upright between 2 pines, eyes catching the flare-red light of the burning SUV and throwing it back pure amber, chest visibly rising and falling with slow, deliberate breath. Davidson's team opened fire as the shape began closing distance down the slope, muzzle flashes strobing the clearing, and the rounds visibly struck mass without dropping it. The creature absorbing the impact through what looked like a ribcage built more like armor plate than flesh, staggering once, then continuing forward at a walk rather than a charge. Cotton fired twice and watched both rounds do nothing she could confirm. "It's not stopping," she said, voice tight. "Nothing's stopping it." Dean had hunted elk in this valley for 20 years and had never seen anything absorb rifle fire and keep its feet, let alone keep walking with what looked disturbingly like patience. Then, at roughly 30 feet, the creature stopped advancing entirely and simply retreated uphill into the tree cover, unhurried, without a single one of the agents managing to land what should have been a fatal shot to the chest. It was a restraint Dean had never once read about in any Bigfoot account he'd spent his life dismissing as campfire talk between hunters who'd had too much to drink. An animal that could close the distance and chose not to finish it. It wasn't behaving like a myth built to frighten campers. It was behaving like something managing casualties on its own side of the fight. Something that understood the math of engagement and had decided this particular exchange wasn't worth finishing. In the chaos of the retreat, Sharp got close enough with a thermal imaging lens to catch one clear frame before the creature vanished fully into the treeline. A wide steel collar embedded deep into the fur at its throat, grown half into the skin the way old restraint scars grow into flesh over years. A serial number stamped into the pitted metal that the lens resolved just clearly enough to read. USDOE Project B88. Dean stood close enough to see it too, and the number burned itself into his memory whether he wanted it there or not. Davidson took the tablet from Sharp's hands without asking, without a word of explanation, and turned his back to review the frame alone, his posture shifting from field agent to something colder, more careful, the posture of a man reading a file he'd hoped never to need. "Sir, that's a Department of Energy designation," Sharp said quietly, and Davidson didn't answer her either. Dean watched something pass between the two agents that had nothing to do with the fire still burning 20 feet away, a look that told him more than any explanation would have. By dawn, federal contractors in unmarked vehicles had already sealed Dead Indian Pass under a hastily issued declaration of critical rockslide zone, fencing the access road with chain link and floodlights before Dean's own department was even permitted back through to recover their vehicles. Davidson handed him a single unsigned page across the hood of a scorched SUV and said almost nothing beyond instructing him where to sign, and Dean read the phrase "national security" twice on that page before he fully understood that no further explanation was ever going to be offered to him, badge or no badge. His injured deputy survived the fracture with a plate and 11 staples and no memory whatsoever of the ravine, the radio, or the 6 words that had drawn Dean down into the dark after him. A gap in his memory his doctors attributed cleanly to the head trauma, and one Dean has never quite managed to believe was only that. Somewhere on an unlisted emergency frequency that same night, a technician monitoring backcountry Wyoming channels recorded 11 seconds of a low guttural sound followed by a single deliberate radio beep, logged into a file, stamped, and never released to anyone outside. A very short list of names. Dean was never given. That single beep has never been decoded, and no equipment on record at that frequency's origin point has ever been officially acknowledged to exist. Sheriff Dean requested the full incident file through proper channels 4 separate times over the following year. Each request came back redacted past the point of readability, with a standard federal cover letter citing an active classification review with no projected end date. The campground families were never publicly identified, and no follow-up news coverage of that November night has ever surfaced outside a handful of local radio logs Dean keeps in a drawer at home, unofficial, undated, and never entered into evidence. Dead Indian Pass remains fenced to this day, the rock slide signage repainted twice now by contractors nobody in the county has ever hired directly. Hunters who've tried the perimeter report motion sensor floodlights activating from positions with no visible power source, and at least one game camera recovered from just outside the fence line captured 11 seconds of static before its memory card failed entirely. The same 11 seconds, almost to the frame, that the unlisted frequency recorded that night. Dean has never been able to confirm the two are connected. He has also never been able to convince himself they aren't. Sheriff Lewis Dean kept his badge, but Dead Indian Pass has never reopened, and every request his office has filed for the incident report has come back the same way. Denied, pending review, indefinitely. What Agent Sharp's thermal camera caught in those 4 seconds has never been made public, and Project B-88 doesn't appear in any federal database Dean has ever been permitted to search. Subscribe to The World Behind Midnight to uncover the next operation before it disappears. Because some secrets are best left behind midnight.